Welcome to the Aboriginal channel. On this episode, we will learn about Maroon colonies and basically disapprove whatever the internet says a Maroon or a Maroon colony is. Whatever it says it is, we're going to disapprove that and show what it really is. But first, we must know about the landscape. So right here, we're looking at an old put together map of Fort Neoheroka. It was Fort Neoheroka is the name of a stronghold constructed in what is now Greene County, North Carolina, by the Tuscarora tribe during the Tuscarora War of 1711 through 1715. So the Indians made this fort right here. Now let's get a closer look at it. You look at the fort, it has angles on it, and at each corner of the fort is like a diamond shape. See these diamond shapes? And then right here you got a round shape that goes like this, sort of artistic. So basically, this is a map of the war that's going on. You got Colonel James Moore, the commander-in-chief down here, commanding the settlers. And over here, you got the Yamasee Battery right here. This Yamasee Indians were the enemies of the Tuscarora, which they went to war, and I guess the white folks, you know how they do. But basically, what we're looking at is these diamond shapes to say that that is how Indians built their forts all around the Americas. So to compare that shape to another fort, we're going to look at Fort Augustine in Florida. So basically, it's right here. This fort has like a square shape with those diamond shapes on each end of the building. Going over to Alabama to Fort Toulouse. Now, I had to find this with the bird's eye or the satellite view, and it basically has that same shape. Now, if we look right here, they try to hide it, but the fort is right here, and then right over here up against this river, you see the fort right here, the same shape with the diamond shapes on each corner of the building. Then if you go over a little bit, right here is another one of those little forts with the diamond shapes on the end. Now, the important part about it is that the fort in Neoheroka was built in the early 1700s. Fort Augustine that we just seen in Florida was built in like the late 1600s. This fort right here, they saying was built in like the 1800s. But now let's go over to the Negro fort down in Florida that they call a Maroon colony. This right here says Fort Gaston, the Negro fort's history buried. So right here you have the river behind it, and then you have the same kind of fort with those same kind of angles at the corners of the building. Of course, the building isn't here right now, but we still looking at the shape and how this part back here has an inlet that goes down to the water. Now, the reason why I know that this is an Indian fortification is because they said it escaped the flooding when the flood season came. The only way that this fort right here could escape the flood season, being up against the river like this, is if it was built on a mound, built high up, and that's what the Indians would do. But they calling it the Negro Fort. They also saying that the colonizers came along and built it. That's what they all say. But just know that this shape is a Aboriginal design right here. Now, how do I know that? Well, let's go over to the Cox Mound Gorget right here in Tennessee at the TennesseeEncyclopedia.net. The Cox Mound or Woodpecker Gorget style is particularly beautiful and enduring symbol of Tennessee's prehistoric inhabitants. Okay, if you look right over here to the right, you will see these shell gorgets right here, and you can look on them and see the same shape as those forts. The four sides, and at each corner, there's sort of like the same shape. Now, how old are these shell gorgets right here? It says just over 30 Cox Mound style gorgets have been found since the late 19th century, primarily from prehistoric Mississippian stone box graves and villages along the lower Tennessee, Cumberland, Duck, Harpeth, and Buffalo rivers of Middle Tennessee and the Middle Tennessee River Valley of northern Alabama. As a result of the frequent mortuary association of Cox Mound gorgets with certain pottery types, namely Matthew's incise, as well as other artifacts, it has been postulated that Cox Mound gorgets date to the period AD 1250 through 1450. So pre-colonization, these gorgets were made way back then with the same shape. Now, what's interesting is that this shape right here has a star in the middle, an 8-pointed star. Now, if you go look at a lot of other forts, but I'm going to pick Fort Wood right here. Fort Wood is what the Statue of Liberty sits on right here. If you look, it has a bunch of points on it. And that's basically the Aboriginals' way of building things with stars and those buildings with the four sides and the diamond shapes at each point. So I showed you those forts because those can technically be considered maroon colonies. Because if you think about what a maroon and a colony is a fort, and a maroon is said to be African runaway slave. But that's not true because we know there were no African slaves and we know who the slaves were. So I'm going to read right here on the Appalachian Mountain books, the Mulligan people. It says, as far as back as we know, the Appalachian region has been the home of small groups of people who chose to live in relative isolation from the mainstream. Pause. To be a maroon, there's a specific criteria you must meet. And it doesn't mean that you have dark red or maroon colored skin and you're a runaway slave. No, it means you're a runaway slave to a region that's hard to get to or very difficult to escape from. So when it says people chose to live in relative isolation from the mainstream, that's being marooned somewhere where you can't be reached easily or you can't escape from easily. That's being marooned. And that's what a maroon means. In the Central America area or Veracruz, it was said that Jasper Yanga, who led a maroon colony in the highlands of Veracruz, it was said that he was an African slave of royal blood. Now, royal blood is a psychological propaganda that you'll see repeat itself throughout history. But basically, we know the guy was not from Africa and he wasn't a slave. So, therefore, he must have been an Aboriginal in the mountain areas previously before the Portuguese and Spanish started bringing white slaves to the area. Those same white slaves that they were bringing to that area committed revolts and ran away and went to those mountain and highland areas and basically gave themselves to the Aboriginal people there who used them to fight and raid the invading Spanish. So you can go look at the Jasper Yanga story. But what people don't understand is that the slaves were actually white people. So it says, before people arrived from Europe and Africa, the region was dotted with settlements like this. So there was already maroon colonies, which are basically forts or enclosed settlements that are in high places or hard to reach places. Because in the North American states, usually the maroon colonies were in the swamps, and the ones in Central America were up in the mountains. But they also had ones in the mountains in North America too. However, it goes on to say, as early as 1665, escaped slaves called Maroons formed small isolated communities, not in Appalachia, but in swamplands nearer the Atlantic coast. At some point, both renegade whites, either banished from the mainstream by force, by social pressure, or by personal preference, and blacks either joined native settlements or formed their own with or without people of other races. So it's saying that whites, so-called blacks, joined native settlements and or formed their own settlement in these swamped areas. Specifically, there's a place called the Great Dismal Swamps. It says the Dismal Swamps are noted places of refuge for runaway Negroes. Now remember, they saying it's for runaway Negroes, right? But the book says that the legislature of Virginia sought to cover up the record of white bondage and its equivalence to Negro servitude. The compiler of Virginia laws, codifying black slavery for the first time, then takes the liberty of altering text to bring earlier legislation into line with his own new notions. For example, of alterations to insert the word slave as a reference to blacks in Virginia when it had not been used to describe them that way before. So if those people that this book is calling blacks weren't slaves, then who were they? They were the Aboriginal people, because a lot of the books describe the Aboriginal people of the Americas as black and Negro. So that's what they calling an Aboriginal right here, is a black. So right here, and it also goes on to say, Richard Legion's eyewitnesses report of a white slave revolt in Barbados in 1649 has been regularly referred to down through the years by at least a dozen later historians as a rebellion of Negro slaves. So they changed the history. White slaves became black slaves or Negro slaves. So when it says that the Great Dismal Swamps became a refuge for runaway Negroes, they became refuge for runaway white slaves. Now, these swamps already consisted of settlements, Aboriginal settlements. So the white folks would run to the Aboriginal people inside of those swamps that were very, very hard to get to. Now, the reason why I believe Jasper Yanga was an Aboriginal, because it says right here that when Christopher Columbus was writing a letter complaining about how he was taken for a politician when he should have been respected as some type of military person, it says, "I to be judged as a captain who went from Spain to the Indies to conquer a people, warlike and numerous, and with customs and beliefs very different from ours, a people living in highlands and mountains." So the people were already living in highlands and mountains in the late 1400s. So by the late 1500s, in the time of Jasper Yanga, it says that he was in the highlands. We know the slave trade didn't happen the way it say it did. They were bringing their white, poor, and criminal elements from their own so-called European nations over here. And those people were running away and going to Aboriginal towns and forts where they were protected and basically left there to fend for themselves, that's the definition of what a Maroon is. It says they living in highlands and mountains, it says right there. It goes on to say, it explains how the European authority dealt with that kind of situation. That's why the Maroon colonies, which is those places hard to reach, like up in the mountain peaks, in the deep swamps. And there's another place that's not talked about a lot, which I'll get to at the end of this video. But right here it's saying, for European authority in the early modern period was the authority of the plain. And that meant flat land, so they controlled anything that was on flat land. It says, of walled towns that could, if necessary, be besieged and starved into submission. Now, in a previous video, I talked about the Natchez Indians and how it says the Union troops walled them off and starved them to death. And over 20,000 of them died right there in Natchez, Mississippi. Well, that's something that they were used to doing in their own countries back then, because it says the European authority in early modern period was the authority of the plain of walled towns that could, if necessary, be besieged and starved into submission. The central authorities feared and hated the mountains. And it says, and of course, for Columbus, the natives of the New World were not merely like the untamed dwellers of the European wastelands. So it's basically saying that the Aboriginal people here used those mountains and those hard to reach places as refuges and places to build their fortresses, because those were hard to reach places and they could defend themselves very easily that way. An example of one of these mountain settlements would be Machu Picchu, which was built a long, long time ago. But let me go over here. I want to read a little bit about the Great Dismal Swamp. It says the Great Dismal Swamp in the Carolinas and Virginia was home to a permanent community of runaways, as described in Harriet Beecher Stowe's historical fiction, Dread, A Story of the Great Dismal Swamp. The expansive wetlands was a source of cypress trees for lumber and fresh game for food and hides. Wetlands provided a slave lair, a terrifying morass that shielded black fugitives. Once again, everything's been changed from white to black, right? So you can look at that and say that shielded white fugitives who were frequently referred to as Maroons. The haven extended over Nansemond, Norfolk, Prince Anne, and Wright counties in Virginia, and south to Camden, Chowan, Currituck, Gates, Passatank, and Perquimans counties in North Carolina. The leadership of Tom Copper, now Tom Copper is an Aboriginal name, a black general, established order at Scratch Hall, a Maroon settlement west of Elizabeth City in Passatank County, North Carolina. So he was basically like a Jasper Yanga, the patriarch of the establishment and the Aboriginal ruler of basically the white slaves. It says white recognition of his sanctuary for escaping slaves resulted in posters announcing a price on Copper's head. After Copper's capture in 1795, the search for his followers continued until 1802, when authorities seized 4 Maroons and hanged them. But one thing we're going to talk about in a later video is the other Maroon colonies, are those Aboriginal forts that were hard to get to, or secluded or isolated from the mainstream. It says Ferriby replaced Tom Copper and imposed order and structure on the slave society. Persistent stalking by professional slave hunters with packs of bloodhounds required extremes of secrecy from hideaway, even to the point of excavating homes underground. Excavating homes underground. So, in a previous video, it was a short video about Rockwall, Texas, where they saying that this 70 feet underground rock wall that went miles was a natural formation. However, I'm saying that it was an underground city or underground town, which we'll talk about in future videos. But right here it's saying that part of the Maroon colonies, was people excavating homes underground. Okay, I'm going back over here to the Muludgeon people so we can understand how it went, right? So it says in 1775, the land speculator Richard Henderson met with the Cherokee leaders at Sycamore Shoals to purchase what became Tennessee and Kentucky. Dragging Canoe gave an impassionate speech against the sale and formed the 5 lower towns of the Chickamauga along the Tennessee River west of Chattanooga. Both white and black renegades settled in these towns, which survived until the Trail of Tears in the 1830s. Now, it says that the Cherokee Dragon Canoe established these towns, and then both white and black renegades settled in these towns, which survived until the Trail of Tears. It says a few relatively isolated tri-racial communities still exist, including not only the Lumbees of North Carolina, the Caramels of Ohio, the Red Bones of Louisiana, and the Brass Ankles of South Carolina. In Appalachia, they include most prominently the Guyanese of Chestnut Ridge in Bourbon County. So that's all Aboriginal people that they saying are Guyanias, which is an African place. So it says, and the Mulligens centered on Newman's Ridge in Hancock County, Tennessee, but spreading out especially into Granger and Hawkins counties, and even into nearby Kentucky and Virginia counties. It is believed that the term Mulligan was first used in 1813 in the records of the Stony Creek Primitive Baptist Church in Scott County, Virginia, to describe families that later came to Newman's Ridge. So there's basically some white slaves they talking about, but when you go look at the images of the Mulligan people, they look like they from India. But understand how it says that these both white and black renegades settled in the town with the Cherokee people. That's the same thing that happened with Jasper Yanga. Jasper Yanga already has settlements in the highlands of Veracruz, and then white or maroon slaves ran away and joined forces with them, and they began to raid the Spanish. So to back up what I was saying about Tom Copper and Bob Farabee and Jasper Yanga being the same kind of people, I'm going to read a little bit about what they had in common. So it says the presence and participation of the Great Dismal Swamp Maroons becomes most clear in this third insurrectionary period of 1800 to 1802. When unrest spread across the state's border and involvement by whites as well as blacks became explicit. Counties surrounding the swamp, 3 in Virginia and 6 in North Carolina, all saw increased guerrilla raids in this time. War bands on the North Carolina side, led by Tom Copper, were multiracial and originated just east of the Scratch Hall Maroon settlement. So Tom Copper was leading guerrilla raids, and that's what he has in common with the rest of these brothers, was the guerrilla warfare that he inflicted on the colonizers. And he did own white slaves. As you can see right here, involvement by whites as well as blacks became explicit. It says, led by Tom Copper, were multiracial. Okay, that meant he owned white slaves who wasn't going to go back into the hands of the white plantation owners. Right here on the slave rebellions, Britannica.com, it says Spanish colonial powers were aware of the community's existence but made little progress against it until 1609 when they assembled troops to retake the former slaves. They raised the settlement and attacked Yanga and his followers, who took to the rainforest and waged guerrilla warfare against them. So Jasper Yanga took to the rainforest and waged guerrilla warfare against the Spaniards. So once again, Jasper Yanga, the guerrilla, right? Now here's one from the Virginia Pilot talking about Bob Farabee. It says whites feared the swamp and the rebellious slaves they sensed were hiding within it. Southern newspapers generally ignored slave unrest, fearing that publicity would prompt uprisings. But in 1823, the Norfolk Herald warned of a militant group of escaped slaves in the swamp, lurking assassins that had already killed several white men. A trained militia with dogs tore through the murky morass, killing and capturing the escapees. Bob Farabee, the reputed leader, who had spent 6 years in the swamp, was captured and later executed. So Bob Farabee was a leader of these lurking assassins, which was basically guerrillas, right? So you have Bob Farabee, Jasper Yanga, and Tom Copper, all militant guerrilla Aboriginal people, right? So one I'm gonna add into there, and you can look this brother up. His name's Billy Bowlegs the first. It says on Wikipedia that Bowlegs and his band lived in relative peace until 1855. Now, Bowlegs was a so-called Seminole who fought in the Seminole Wars. It says a group of Army engineers and surveyors invaded his territory in southwest Florida, where they cut down banana trees and destroyed other property in the course of building forts. Some historians have viewed these actions as intentional provocation to make Bowlegs react, so the settlers would have a reason to force the Seminole out. If so, the provocation worked. Bowlegs led his warriors in sporadic attacks against settlers for the next few years in what is known as the Third Seminole War. The army was unable to subdue his guerrilla warfare. So once again, Billy Bowlegs, Jasper Yanga, Bob Farabee, Tom Copper, all Aboriginal leaders who fought against these colonizers with guerrilla warfare. So basically, the moral to the Maroon colony story is that they were led by Aboriginal kings or chiefdoms who owned and operated colonies or forts out of the way or in isolated locations. And they also owned white runaway slaves who, when the colonizers came with the hound dogs, they fought. So to bring this around full circle, we got to understand that the colonizers' issue with Aboriginal people, whether it be the Aboriginals at a flatland fort or a fort with easy access or a fort that was isolated and very hard to get to, the issue that the colonizers had was their slaves, their white slaves running to the Indians. So right here it says, Negro or slave shall hereafter fall into your hands. You shall straightway conduct them to Colonel George Mason's house on the Potomac River. And I do in behalf of that colony engage that you shall there receive immediately upon the delivery of every such runaway, 1 good gun and 2 blankets, or the value thereof. So it's saying right here that the runaway slaves, it says Negro, but that's the way history is written. So when you say Negro slave, it really means white slave. So the white slaves was running to these Indians. It said the chiefs, however, were not overly enthusiastic about helping, acknowledging their previous failure at rounding up Virginia's Maroons. They replied to Spotswood's plea for collaboration. As to the proposition you made relating to Negroes, we promise that if any runaway Negroes or slaves shall happen to fall into our hands, we will carry them to Colonel Mason's on Potomac River for ye reward you proposed. But as to those Negroes which you said we promised last year to send home, we hope you will excuse us, because they lie very much out of our way and may be had more easily by other Indians. Yet if we serve Virginia in any other thing, we shall be glad of an opportunity of doing it. So basically, once again, it's saying Negroes, but it's white slaves. It goes on to say Native Americans' cooperation was also sought in Maryland. The council accused the Shawnees in 1722 of entertaining our runaway Negro slaves. Once again, they talking about runaway white slaves. To entice them to give the Maroons up, the council proposed to offer 2 leaders a Strout-matched coat and a pair of silk stockings as a preliminary gesture of friendship. And the Shawnee would receive 2 coats and 1 gun for every runaway he would return. So remember, they was hiring the Aboriginal people to catch these runaways, but they was having issues because Indians was keeping them. So right here, it's talking about the slaves or the Maroons in Florida with the Seminoles. You're going to hear the word black and Negro slaves said, but understand these are white slaves they're talking about. It says, by far the most significant locale of Maroon activity was the vast hammock and swampland of Florida. Now remember, the book on white slavery says that the white slaves would run away to Florida. Okay. It says here, as Maroons, American blacks, most of whom were ex-slaves of whites. Now, understand how it's wording that. It's trying to make sure that you know that these so-called Maroons were American blacks, which just by the word Maroons, they should have all been ex-slaves of whites, it says, but it says most of whom were ex-slaves of whites, made their only successful organized violent resistance to the system of slavery. This they did in the conflict of 1835 to 1842, the Second Seminole War. So the white slaves were fighting on the side of Aboriginals in Florida in that war. As far back as 1687, slaves of American colonists in the Carolina region began escaping southward to the sanctuary of Spanish-held Florida. Now, Florida was never held by the Spanish, but that's what colonized propaganda says. But it was during the British regiment in Florida, 1763 to 1783, that black slave escapees from the north became an important element among the Seminole Indians of northern Florida. In addition to the Negroes who came among the Seminoles as refugees, blacks were also purchased as slaves by the Seminoles. Now, when it says Negroes and blacks, it's talking about whites. That's how they switched the history up. They just took the word and white out and put black, and that's what it is. So Seminole slavery, however, was far milder than the American system of bondage. Now, remember, the book says that these white slaves would rather take their chances with the Indians rather than be a slave on the white plantation because they were being enslaved to death. All this other things was happening to them. But it says the Seminoles let their slaves lead an autonomous life in their own black villages on their own farms, with the Indians contented to take their nominal slaves only a 10-bushel share per farm of their annual corn crop. In reality, they were more like tenants than slaves. So the white folks were treated humanely in Florida by the Indians and were able to actually have their own little plots of land where they were barely taxed and they lived like tenants rather than slaves. And that's why they were running there, because they knew that the people were good like that. Okay. So here's something said about Jasper Yanga under his Wikipedia page. It says, upon the approach of the Spanish troops, now this was earlier I spoke in the video about Yanga being attacked but taken to the forest and then applying guerrilla warfare on the Spanish. Okay, so this is basically talking about the same thing. It says, upon the approach of the Spanish troops, Yanga sent terms of peace via a captured Spaniard. He asked for a treaty akin to those that had settled hostilities between Indians and Spaniards, an area of self-rule in return for tribute and promises to support the Spanish if they were attacked. In addition, Yanga said this proposed district would return any slaves who might flee to it. This last concession was necessary to soothe the worries of the many slave owners in the region. So the Spanish colonizers' issue with Jasper Yanga was the fact that their white slaves were running to his highland colonies as a refuge. One last thing. Now, remember, the article said that the Great Dismal Swamp was a refuge for runaway Negroes, right? So the book on white slavery, they were white and they were slaves. It says white slaves who ran away found safe haven in portions of North Carolina, which became known in Virginia as the refuge of runaways. So the book says the refuge of runaways, not the refuge for runaway Negroes, like the article said. So I just pointed that out just to show you how they changed these words around through the history books, which has all been a lie. So therefore, if it's a lie, then what's the truth? If it's a lie,